Well, look, what a year it's been, really. I mean, it's not actually even a year since the revelations of sexual harassment and assault were first made against the Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein last autumn. And since then, we have seen the fall from grace of one of the most powerful men in the industry. I mean, in the end, I think it was more than 75 women accused Harvey Weinstein of sexual misconduct, and he actually now faces prosecution. In May, he was charged with rape and sexual assault. And it wasn't just limited to Weinstein. Accusations were then made against other producers, directors, stars. Vast numbers of women, and actually some men as well, felt able to come forward with their own experiences of sexual harassment and assault from prominent figures. And in fact, very quickly, the hashtag MeToo went absolutely viral. I think something like 12 million people had used it to share their stories of sexual harassment and assault on social media just in the weeks following the Weinstein revelations. And such an outpouring really has to be welcomed because it lifted the mask, even for a brief period of time, that allows oppressive behaviour to go on unchallenged, often with other people's knowledge. Because when you think about Harvey Weinstein, you know, a lot of young women didn't come forward because they felt he was so powerful, he'd destroy their lives. People just say, oh, you know, Harvey, he's just like that. And I would say that Hollywood scandal brought the issue of sexual harassment out into the open on a huge scale. It's actually just worth remembering, though, at this point, that it wasn't actually the Hollywood stars that started the hashtag MeToo movement. It was actually started by a black youth worker called Tarana Burke, who actually works in a poor neighbourhood in New York. She started it in 2007 as a way of reaching out to poor women and girls who were facing abuse, and actually she continues to work on those projects today. But like I say, the scandal started in Hollywood, but it was not long before it spread. And it engulfed many other organisations and institutions, including the UK Parliament and NGOs and charities. You know, Tory Minister Michael Fallon was forced to resign over sexual misconduct. I think something like 28 other Tory MPs, and actually several Labour figures as well, are being investigated over similar issues. Oxfam, very high-profile charity, was also hit by the scandal when it was revealed that senior Oxfam staff had paid earthquake survivors in Haiti for sex, and actually that had been covered up. And really, they were saying this is just the tip of the iceberg, really. And it triggered sort of similar action from women at other charities like Save the Children, Médecins Sans Frontières. There was hashtags, hashtag Aid2, hashtag UN2 on the back of the MeToo movement. And of course, all this is taking place at a time when we have the President of the USA, Donald Trump, a vile misogynist who's actually bragged about grabbing women by the pussy. And I think, in part, the revelations and the outcry reflect changed times where women are demanding to be heard. I mean, we had Michael Fallon, the Tory minister, forced to resign. He claimed his behaviour was acceptable 10 or 15 years ago. Well, I mean, clearly it wasn't acceptable. But the difference is women are perhaps feeling more confident to speak out. And I think it's probably led to many women, the stars in Hollywood, but actually all of us, reflecting on our experience from many years ago and feeling that things were not acceptable. And I think also what began as a discussion about sexual harassment has broadened out to other aspects of the fight for women's liberation. Because the hashtag MeToo movement took place really at a time of other campaigns, very prominently, sort of simultaneously almost, was the one regarding the sort of Time's Up movement over pay. And the outcry, particularly the BBC pay scandal, where you saw male presenters being paid far more than women who were doing the same job. And I don't really think it's a surprise that the position of women is on the agenda. We had a meeting earlier today talking about 100 years since women got the vote. Let's be clear, since some women got the vote at that point. And actually in those 100 years, women's lives have been transformed. Women, we go on to further and higher education in much bigger numbers. We expect to do paid work out in the workforce. We don't expect to have to give up that work if we were to marry or have children and just, stay in the home and monotonous housework. We expect to be financially independent. I'm always shocked to remind myself, it was up until the 1970s, it was actually hard for women to even get credit without a permission from a man. And, women expect in this country to be able to get an abortion if we need it. And so in many ways, we've come a long way. And obviously we owe that to the people who have fought and challenged and struggled to win those things. But as has really been exposed this last year with the MeToo movement, a lot hasn't changed, or hasn't changed nearly enough. And women's oppression is very much alive and kicking. And it's not only about sexual harassment. We know how women are judged on our appearance in a way that men aren't. And I think it'd be interesting, people's experiences about social media. Has this accelerated it really? The pressure, celebrity culture and selfies. There's probably different generations here who might want to discuss those pressures there. But that has led, all those pressures, to a massive increase in cosmetic surgery. Apparently it was up 13% last year. And I don't know if people saw the story. It was an investigation by the Financial Times. They're the President's Club had this charity event earlier this year, and it did very much reveal that the women who were hired to work there as waitresses were hired on the basis of their looks. They were actually told how to dress. This included black underwear. They were actually subject to harassment whilst they were working. But one of the auction prizes, this was a male-only event that they were working at, one of the prizes at the auction was a course of plastic surgery called Spice Up Your Wife. And then you think about the lack of older women on television and in the media, and the abuse older women often get, or even more black women like Diane Abbott, the amount of abuse they get. And of course, we've seen over the last decades the rise of what we've often called raunch culture and a new sexism, where, the old-fashioned sexist ideas are essentially repackaged and sold back to us as empowering. We know how normalised almost lap dancing has become, so much so it's advertised as a great night out for women too. I saw it advertised as a Valentine's package that men could take their partners to this year. Pole dancing as exercise, the sexualisation of nightclub nights in universities that lead often to a lot of unwanted attention. There was a Drink-Aware survey in 2014. It found a third of young women admitted that they'd received inappropriate or unwanted physical attention on a night out. And actually, when you look at education itself, it's one of these things can't get any worse, but the whole market in education and the thousands of pounds of fees that people have to pay do impact on women. I saw agencies at one university operating a few years ago that had set up this idea that students could register to find a so-called sugar daddy who would help pay their university costs and expenses. So we live in this real society where, as well, women are encouraged to be viewed as sexually available, but then every effort is made to blame the victim if they're attacked. Think of the young women who were abused in places like Rotherham and Oxford. The whole main media story was to focus on what were in those cases, mainly Asian perpetrators. Let's be clear, abuse is not limited to one community. The real story was, though, when those girls had gone to the police over many years, they were not believed. The abuse was covered up and young girls at 13 were actually blamed. And I think it really shows how women's bodies are still battlegrounds. You can't really win. If you dress scantily, then you're a slut and you asked for it. If you cover up, it's also a problem. Think of the Muslim women in France who were forced to, undress by armed police on a beach because they were wearing a burkini. And actually, it's not just about that. It's women, and particularly Muslim women, facing much more violence, actually, in growing Islamophobia across Europe. And when you do look at the violence, domestic violence stats are truly depressing when you think that 2 women are killed each week. Even the NUS itself, National Union of Students, in 2014, did a survey that found 1 in 4 university students had experienced sexual violence. And of course, harassment and violence against women is made much worse by austerity and the cuts to things like women's refuges and all the measures that impact on women's economic independence. I think it's also worth saying at this point about trans women, who also still face huge levels of violence and hate crime. I think it's important that we say quite proudly that our politics as socialists here is one that stands with all the oppressed and it supports the rights of trans people and those who are non-binary. All this, at the same time, very few women seen at the top of society. Only 32% of MPs are women. Actually, that's quite a big improvement in the last few years, but still a gap. But when it comes to, for example, running top companies in the UK, women are actually outnumbered by Daves. Only 70% of chief executives in the FTSE 100 are women. 9 are called David. And on top of all this, and much else besides, women are still not paid equally. I mean, it's actually nearly 50 years since the Equal Pay Act. We still actually don't have real equal pay. Apparently, the average gender pay gap across the UK is over 18%. The Foresight Society said it will take 100 years to close the gap. So it's not happening soon. Also, women are concentrated in some of the poorest sectors, less secure work, and lose out through maternity leave as well. So it's interesting. I mentioned the fact that the Time's Up movement was sort of happened simultaneously almost alongside the MeToo movement. At the Golden Globes in January, some actors actually brought activists to highlight the campaigns. People might have seen Gemma Arterton, who was photographed with Gwen Davis and Eileen Pullen, who were two of the women who'd worked at Ford Dagenham in 1968, which had led to the fight for equal pay. So all this, and much, much more, it's not really a surprise. There's been a resurgence of interest in ideas about women's liberation. And in many ways, I would say these movements, Time's Up and MeToo, they're a consequence, aren't they, of women feeling we need to do something. And they've really raised the question of, how can the reality of the changes in women's lives coexist with these backward ideas still? It's a real contradiction, isn't it? We seem to have this legal equality on every level, but rampant sexism at the same time in society. Well, how on earth can this be, and what can we do? I'm just going to have a little look first at the film industry, actually, because it shines a light as well on a lot of different aspects of women's oppression, and obviously this is where the Me Too movement started from. But actually, the Hollywood and film industry, more broadly, are built on bullying, competitive and brutally sexist practices, both behind and in front of the camera. And it's quite interesting. Last year, the British Film Institute released its filmography of British film, a study of 10,000 films made in Britain. It showed that in 2017, only 30% of actors cast in films were women. In 1913, the figure was 31%. So we've gone backwards in 100 years about women. The most popular word in British film titles is man. Female actors, report their despair at constantly being offered small parts, prostitute, waitress, secretary. Men are offered boss, detective, doctor. And really, the lack of lead women in films, or, often maybe there's one lead woman, all the rest are men, kind of ends up being really normalised. And you don't always realise how normalised it is until you see films like The Last Jedi or Black Panther. I don't know if people saw them this year. We've actually lots of women leading, and it makes you kind of wake up to the fact you don't always see that portrayed in film. And I'm talking about women. Obviously, the same is even more true for black actors and black women actors. And it's not just about how women are about being represented, it's about how women are represented. I don't know if people have heard of the Bechdel test, which is named after American cartoonist Alison Bechdel, where to pass it, you question whether a work of fiction features at least two women talking to each other about something other than a man. Because often this is the main way women are portrayed in film, that's their conversation. And as I say, it's not just this ideological role of show business and the lack of female leaders, lead actors, or how women are portrayed. These are important because they impact on wider society, don't they? They play a role in terms of how women are seen and how we see ourselves as well. There's also the whole issue of jobs in the film industry. Apparently, in that same filmography I was talking about, in 100 years up to 2017, less than 1% of films were actually made with a majority film crew. But only 4.5% of all films have been directed by women. So you have this whole industry structured around reinforcing gender roles. It's really then hardly surprising that this sexist atmosphere prevails. And the working practices in Hollywood actually have a lot in common with other industries where levels of sexual harassment also tend to be high. I'll come back to that. But, young women actors are usually quite dependent on men to give them work, men in positions of power like Weinstein. And it's also true that young workers in the industry are more likely to be freelance and therefore quite isolated and vulnerable. And really that's what unfolded, didn't it, in all the stories in the Me Too movement, sort of the stories of castings taking place in private places like hotel rooms and one-on-one in that way. But I would say it's important not just to focus on the stars, but also the broader workforce too. Because if the Hollywood revelations exposed what goes on behind closed hotel doors for actors, then think about the hotel cleaners or the housekeepers and the maids that have to go into those rooms on their own every day and not just in Hollywood. Remember the case of Dominique Strauss-Kahn? He was the former head of the IMF, people remember it, in 2011, accused of a brutal assault by Nafissatou Diallo, who was a maid in a Manhattan hotel. And the point is here really is that every day, women who work as housekeepers or waitresses or domestic workers are incredibly vulnerable to harassment, low-waged, ununionised, often migrant workers, often from managers but also from co-workers and customers. In fact, a survey by the Chicago Housekeepers Union found 60% had been sexually harassed. This isn't a problem just in Hollywood or in the hotel industry. Women face sexual harassment in every workplace. A TUC report in 2016, which was in conjunction with the Everyday Sexism Project, showed almost half of all women asked had experienced some sexual harassment at work, over 75% of younger women. Those most likely to have faced harassment were women not on permanent contracts, especially agency workers, and those on zero-hour contracts. Most didn't report it. Only 1% reported it to a union rep. And remember, lots of these women were working in industries where they wouldn't have been in a union. So you can see how you're much more likely to face harassment if you're in insecure work and less able to do something about it. This is a real unifying factor in these sectors. You know, freelance, individualised culture, younger women workers, in particular working on their own without having ability to do something about things. But like I say, sexual harassment doesn't always take place just in isolation. Often workers in these industries report a general atmosphere of bullying and harassment. And actually, there's quite a lot to be done there about collectivising our response, because at least collective organisation is a crucial step towards not only dealing effectively with harassment when it occurs, but trying to change the atmosphere in a workplace or industry or university seminar room so it makes it much less likely to occur. And actually, the TUC makes a lot of recommendations about training and improving responses. Actually, their first recommendation for employers was decent jobs, not casualised jobs. Now, of course, this doesn't eliminate the problem, but it certainly helps. But the thing is, isn't it, we have seen these attitudes and everything we've just talked about and experience extend beyond the workplace. And really, I think the MeToo movement highlighted how widespread sexual harassment is beyond work, but in streets, relationships, public places. So what does all this mean for us? Because it's clear from everything I've just saying that things don't just get better. Things can go backwards. You know, sexism doesn't just fade away. You know, the fight for women's rights can go backwards as well as forwards. And I would say that if we agree that despite the big changes in women's lives, that women's oppression is very much a reality, well, the next question is why? We need an understanding of this to find a solution. Because our analysis of the causes of women's oppression is actually going to determine how we fight against it. And in the last few years, a few years really, there's been this whole resurgence of, if you like, a common sense view that this behaviour is natural. You know, men and women, they're just different. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. And what can we do to change that fact? This is a very pessimistic and right-wing conclusion. You know, really it's saying you can struggle all you want against this, but in the end it's natural. Men and women are always going to behave in this way. I would say really it's a form of biological determinism, and I don't think we should buy into it, not least actually because, as we explored in some of the meetings yesterday, sexism and women's oppression hasn't always existed. But there's another explanation that comes out, and a lot of people are drawn to at the moment, and that sometimes uses the term patriarchy, which, to be honest, can mean a lot of different things to different people. Theoretically, it means essentially rule by men, and the idea that all men would oppress all women, and that this is the main division in society. And I think some of the ideas that we come across around privilege theory and things draw on it. You know, the idea that all men are privileged as a consequence, they're just benefiting from women's oppression. And of course, these ideas have a resonance, because they reflect a surface appearance. The experience of oppression is often at the hands of an individual man. But there are consequences to this approach, because if we're saying men are part of the problem, then they're definitely not part of the solution. There's no role for them in the fight against sexism or women's oppression. And, you know, maybe people think the way forward is for women to organise separately. And again, I don't think this is something we should buy into it. And again, I'm going to come back to that. But it is a question that if you accepted that, well, why do men rule? And sometimes you hear arguments from people that, you know, even from the left of people, that perhaps it's in men's nature to be more aggressive and dominant. You know, that if women ruled the world, there'd not be all this war and economic crisis. I mean, this was actually put forward in quite serious articles that there wouldn't have been an economic crash if women had been in charge in that way. I think it's worth noting that women have been in positions of power and acted in the same ways, you know, that don't fit with this stereotype. I mean, I just reel them off. Margaret Thatcher, Theresa May, Condoleezza Rice, Madeleine Albright. We could go on really here. And actually, I do think this view is not really that different from the dominant conservative view. It's a biological view. It's natural. Women and men are just different. What can we do about it? We're all going to be locked into battle with each other. As I say, I don't think we should buy into these explanations, because sexism hasn't always existed, and neither of these really offer a solution or way out of the situation. Instead, I think we have to look at the deeper structures at work which shape men's and women's behaviour and expectations and their attitudes towards one another. Because women's oppression and sexism are really built into the system in which we live, the system of capitalism, a system in which everything has become a commodity. Women's bodies, sexuality, I mean, even International Women's Day, sponsored by Amazon, McDonald's and Caterpillar. But the oppression, obviously, as I said, how it plays out is obviously in an individualised way, We often we experience sexism as individuals, often from individual men, and I think we should be the first people to challenge that, of course. But sexism itself doesn't just come from individuals, because society is not just made up of competing individuals wielding power over each other. Inequality and oppression are rooted in the economic structure of society. Because when we talk about capitalism, it's a class society. A minority class owns and controls all the means of producing wealth, of producing what we need to live, and they exploit the majority of us. Most of us have no other way to earn a living but to go and sell our ability to work to one of these people at the top. Key power relations in society flow from that central antagonism of class. And capitalism itself absolutely thrives on sexism, partly because actually, like all forms of oppression, divide and rule is very useful if you're a minority at the top. It's helpful for men and women to be blaming each other rather than the minority up there. But also, capitalism really needs the unpaid labour of women in the family to be able to function. And here, let's just think of the massive amount of unpaid care and work that's done in the family, predominantly still by women, do the majority of childcare, housework and care for the elderly. Just think of all the cooking and washing and cleaning in every individual household that takes place that enables us all to be able to go to work the next day, and in particular for children to be brought up, a new generation to be able to work in that system. All of this happens with no cost to the capitalist class at all. In fact, the UN estimated quite recently women's unpaid labour is worth more than $3 trillion annually to capitalism globally. Now, this isn't something that just happens because individual men in each individual family are sexist and sit back and force the women to do the work. It's actually something structured into society. The idea of the nuclear family and women's role within it is hugely powerful, and it's backed up by policy, ideology and financial incentives. Now, of course, there have been changes regarding women and their role and families and children. Actually, a lot more women have children later or don't have children at all. It's quite interesting. The ONS did a survey last November, and it was of women born in 1971, 82% had children by the time they were 45. So, clear majority of women do have children. It's worth noting, isn't it, though, in all these discussions about women and children, it's always about, are women leaving it too late? Are they selfish because they've done something else? Conveniently absenting the men from any of these decisions. And this is driven from the media and the top. But the point here is that the way that maternity and paternity leave is structured mean the way the women end up at home. Paid paternity is just 2 weeks. We've just looked at how women earn far less. So the economic pressure, of course, is for the man to go back to work, women to stay at home with a new baby. Maternity pay itself is so low, so many new dads end up working the longest hours, actually, in society. So by default, the woman becomes the expert child carer, is at home more, therefore takes on more of the housework there. Never mind all the ideological pressure in society to do these things as well. And of course, you think about all the cuts that we mentioned about welfare services, nursery provision, impact on women more who end up picking up the slack. And so really, you see very much about, although women now make up half the workforce in Britain, are still seen as the primary caregivers, and crucially, our society is geared towards women taking on that role, which actually makes it really hard to live in any other way, even though lots of people try to do so. And, of course, capitalism is quite adaptable. It's happy to incorporate some changes to the family, gay marriage, same-sex adoption, but the family's still with us. Now, just pause a second. We've seen quite a long way from where we were at the beginning. We started talking about sexual harassment. We're now talking about women's role in the family. But this is very important because it's from this. All the ideas about what a woman and what a man should be start to become from and shaped, really. The idea women should be caring, nurturing, friendly, willing to please, as well as sexually desirable and fertile, by the way. Hence the notion, you've heard the phrase, an older woman is past it. Well, past what? Well, past childbearing age. This whole thing that's reinforced about your role in life. And men should be a lot more confident, outgoing. They're going to be more aggressive. They're going to be more rational than emotional. These are all reinforced as well by the major institutions in society. And even if we don't live in these stereotypical families, loads of us don't, and even if we share the caring and the housework, because obviously we do strive to share these things in our society, it's still a powerful ideology that shapes our experience. It's this ideal held up, normalised across society, and so much else is built around it. Just as an aside here, I'm not saying you can't like your family as well. It can be a source of support. A lot of people have quite a contradictory relationship with their family, actually. But what I'm trying to make is the point is that the role it plays in society. And as I say, it remains in place despite changing lives of women. And so sexist ideas develop not just out of men's heads or in a vacuum, but as a consequence of how society is organised and women's role within it. This is important because this is the underlying material basis for women's oppression, of which sexual harassment is a symptom. And of course, commodification and the drive for profit at the heart of capitalism means there's constantly a search for make money out of any area of life, create a market from it. And this has happened to whole aspects of women's lives, particularly in the last 10, 15 years. Like we said at the beginning, it's not enough just to have the right makeup and clothes. You have to have the plastic surgery to achieve that ideal. And you think about all that sexual liberalisation that was fought for in the 60s and 70s, becoming really a commodification now, the commodification of everything to do with our sexuality. And the raunch culture, far from being liberating, reinforces this idea of women as sex objects, sexually available, again, underpinning the harassment scandals of recent months. So, if we are seeing and arguing that women's oppression and sexism are structured into society and rooted in capitalism, then the logical conclusion is we have to get rid of that whole system. We would argue the struggle for women's liberation is connected to the fight against the whole of that society, against the system of capitalism. But there is a question, because if we're going to take on that system, where is the power to challenge it? And I just want to say here, not all women actually share the same interests. Now, of course, some of this is easy to see. I mentioned her name before. It's very clear that not all women are in it together when you look at Theresa May. But she does claim to be a feminist, despite the fact she's in alliance with the bigots of the DUP who are preventing abortion laws in Northern Ireland. She voted actually to reduce the abortion time limit. She's presided over austerity that have absolutely massively impacted on women when we think about the women's refuges closing or disabled people forced off benefits. Never mind actually women locked in detention centres. But it's not to say that all women don't experience sexism. They do. But their position in society affects their experience of oppression. And what side you're on of the class divide affects that. A very obvious example is someone like Kate Middleton, now Duchess of Cambridge, married to Prince William, I think it is. Now, it's very true, she is objectified. I don't know about you, I've never actually heard her voice. It's all about how she looks, her hair, what clothes she wears, now all about her children, actually. But her experience is very different, isn't it, than if you're a single parent, on a council estate with no access to affordable childcare, having your benefits sanctioned, forced to go to a food bank. Very different experience. She's got all the paid help for the childcare, the holidays, etc. there. And obviously when it comes to things like abortion, it's always been a class issue. Even when it was illegal, if you're rich, you could get access to it if you could pay and travel. It was poor and working class women forced to the back streets who died. Even in the workplace, not true that all women have the same interests. One of the key disputes this year was actually in the universities, where workers and lecturers there took strike action against cuts to pensions. Now, it's worth noting at this point that actually universities and academia are a place where harassment is actually rife. According to a Guardian newspaper investigation this year, sexual harassment in academia is at an epidemic level. And many of the women who actually do report issues there are encouraged, not to lodge complaints and settle in another way. And again, we looked at the nature of work that leads to it. It's similar. PhD students supervised on a one-to-one level, short-term contracts, casualised working, often quite isolated. But the strike by the UCU union members involves thousands of women on the picket lines, alongside their male colleagues, many of the younger women involved, and those actually PhD students. What's interesting, though, is that they absolutely had nothing in common with the Vice-Chancellor of Bath University, a woman, Dame Glynis Breakwell, the highest paid Vice-Chancellor in Britain, earning nearly $500,000 a year. She was at the forefront of trying to attack that pension scheme. So you can see very clearly it's just not true. All women have the same interests. Some women are actually benefiting from the system. In fact, I would say those men and women who were on those UCU picket lines had much closer interests together, pitched against those people at the top. And we would argue, really, that women have an interest, actually, with working class men, fighting for women's rights and for all workers' rights. And that class offers a potential for unity rather than competing different oppressions. It can be a source of potential power. Now, of course, just because we can argue that working class men and women have a shared interest to fight those at the top doesn't just mean that sexist ideas just disappear. Of course, they do exist. And as I say, when we looked at some of what we've looked at already in this meeting, it's not a surprise that people can end up holding those ideas, because not only is the role of women structured into society, but the ideas to reinforce this are pumped out from everywhere. And many of those ideas really are perpetuated by the institutions at the top of society. And I just want to make this point because I think often working class people are blamed for having, backward ideas in this because they're uneducated or something. Actually, I think some of the worst cases of sexism I've seen have been in the Houses of Parliament, where you see how women are treated by other male MPs, untrivialised. You think about the city itself, the City of London, the finance area, absolutely male-dominated. I found this fantastic excuses of male companies why they didn't have women on their boards. Some of them, all the good women, have been snapped up. We've got one woman on the board, so we're done. It's someone else's turn. I mean, it went through the sexism at the top of society in that way. Like I said, the male-only gentlemen's club, like the President's Club. Oxford University has the highest rate of sexual harassment cases out of all the unis in Britain. And these are the institutions where future politicians and journalists and business leaders emerge from that try and shape and influence the ideas that pump out a lot of the ideas of how women should be, really. The key question, though, is whether working class men have an interest in changing ideas. And I think that actually they can be wanting something different. Just like people were during things like the Ford-Dagenham fight over equal pay, the miners' strike, the fight for abortion rights, where demos were led by the TUC. And I think we have to be clear here how change actually comes about through real struggles. Women winning the vote, getting the equal pay in theory, abortion rights. Changes in that way also about changes in attitudes and about towards women themselves. And you can see at times of high struggle how working class men and women have an interest in fighting together against their exploitation at work, but also against women's oppression. And let's be clear here, we're not talking about, we have to go, to workers and go, please support us women, like we're victims or something, it's a moral duty. We're part of that working class and been part of fighting it over those things together and being at the forefront of recent struggles. I mentioned the UCU dispute. We've had people coming here from the NHS strikes and different things like this. Women are half the workforce in Britain and have been at the forefront of these struggles alongside men in that way. But we can only use that power effectively if we're united. And that means trying to overcome these divisions that are constantly stoked up by our rulers between us in that way and taking on arguments. And of course, there are arguments to be had sometimes, but you can see in the experience of struggle itself how people change their ideas about each other, but about how you feel about yourself as well. Any of you who've ever been on a demonstration probably have come in some way out looking a little bit different, maybe covered in some face paint, stickers, not so worried about how you looked on that demonstration as when you went into it. Or you think about the UCU lecturers, the women posing for selfies, not with contoured makeup, but with their placards and their banners and all this, and actually getting a different sense of who they are, that it's not necessarily about how they look, but what they're doing and how they're working with other people, their sense of their power and agency in that way. And it's interesting about that because, there was a quote from a suffragette who wrote about how it felt for young women joining the struggle for women to get the vote. And she said it gave us a release of energy. It gave us a sense of being some use in the scheme of things. It made us feel we were part of life, not just watching it. It gave us hope of freedom and power and opportunity. Actually, I've read interviews of women who felt very similarly coming out of the fight for abortion rights in Ireland quite recently and how they've been able to win those arguments and been part of a much bigger struggle but didn't just want to stop there. This shows how we have a potential for actual change in society and change in ourselves as well. So what does that mean to sum up as we reflect on the MeToo movement? And I hope people are going to draw out the things that they wanted to come and discuss. What is clear is women's oppression is very deep-rooted. It hasn't always existed, it isn't inevitable. The MeToo movement has shone a light on how many women have been treated, but were afraid to say things about. And it's good that women feel more confident to speak out. We want people to come forward and be listened to. And actually, like I said before, fighting a sexist and bullying culture in the workplace that allows harassment to take place is important through collective union organisation. I've been reading the reports coming off the back of the MeToo movement, talking about hotel workers getting unionised, arguing for panic buttons, arguing with their employers for better safety at work. But crucially, a fight against casualised work that leaves people in a vulnerable position, whether it's actors, chambermaids, cleaners, waitresses, PhD students or McDonald's workers. We don't want people to be in these vulnerable positions. But also we need to challenge it through protest, collective action on a broader level. Think of all the battles on campuses that students have organised against sexism on campus for many years. Actually, lots of student unions do have good policies on sexual harassment, but sometimes they have to be pressured to actually enforce them. But we have to fight on a much wider level too. Because what we're talking about is how the fight against sexual harassment has to be twinned with a fight for a better society that uproots women's oppression totally. People's ideas can change. History has shown that in social and political struggles, people have confronted their own ideas and behaviour and recognised the rights and dignity of other groups. The greater the struggle, the more fundamentally ideas are challenged. The biggest changes have come when there's been revolutionary upheaval. And so we as socialists, we have a vision of liberation that is more than the right not to be harassed. It's more than the right just to have equality in a miserable, austerity-driven world. We actually have a vision of a world free of exploitation and oppression where we can all explore our real potential.
Brilliant, thank you, Amy. Okay, so it's now time for discussion. So because it's being filmed and because we can have some more fun with the microphone, if you want to indicate, and then I'll call you in two, so we don't have a great movement around the room. So if you want to come up to the front, comrade there, if you want to come up to the front, and you'll be second. So I don't need to tell you that we always say if you don't want to be filmed, then that's fine. Because of the nature of the discussion, we may have more people who don't want to be filmed, and that's absolutely fine. And also, if people want to share, just be respectful of people's stories. I'm sure you didn't need to tell them that.
I'm in year 8, and a few weeks ago, 2 of my best friends had the confidence to tell a teacher that they had been sexually assaulted for over 2 months. The boy who sexually assaulted them was suspended for only 2 days, but when he came back, he told all of our year that my friends were like sluts, and he bragged about what he did like it was an accomplishment. They told the teacher about the name calling, and they were ignored. My friend had the confidence to tell a teacher, but still nothing changed. Sexual assault shouldn't be the norm for me. School should be a safe place. But what are we going to do to make a change?
Hi, I've got a few things I wanted to pick up from that Amy was talking about. The first is the social pressure on women on how to look like, what to dress. I can go into H&M and then go into Next and have to buy probably the same item but 4 sizes difference. What's that about? Oh, H&M are doing something about it now. Are they? I haven't seen it. You know, I've got a little sister. She's 13 and she has to dress in a size that she shouldn't be dressing it, and I have to watch her and say, it's not you, Katie, it is the system, it's not you. And so I think that is a big part of, you see models who are airbrushed, Kim Kardashian, plastic surgery, airbrush, and that's how women are supposed to look like. I don't know, I don't think so. Secondly, victim blaming is such a big thing. Why can't we teach people not to assault people? Why do we have to tell girls, don't, skirt a bit lower? No, girls should be able to wear what they want to wear. How about don't assault people? That's what people should be taught. Okay, so university culture, as Amy said. I might dress up on a night out. That doesn't mean I want male attention or even female attention. It's because I look good, I feel good, I'm there to have a good time. But the culture at universities is you go on a night out to pull. I'm going on a night out to have a good time. And that is a big thing at universities, especially when boys want to sleep with girls, but call them sluts when they sleep around, but then call them frigid when they don't sleep with them. I don't know where the logic in that is. And, personally, I have a lot of opinions, I stand up for things, and that makes me a bitch. I have opinions, and I'm not afraid to turn around to people. If I had someone tell me that socialism was when the banks run everything, and I said, I think you got that a bit wrong, I was then deemed a bitch. This is the culture that people are living in, young people are having to live in. And the fact that it's happening when we're younger, we're then grown up to think that it's normal, and we need to break that habit and teach people that from a young age that, no, you be who you want to be and you say what you want to say and you have every right to. Just because you're a woman doesn't mean you shouldn't. Sorry. And the MeToo movement is so important because it's about women and men coming together in solidarity to say, I've been abused and I want to stand up and help other people, because the police don't care. And I can say that on personal level. I can say that I've seen friends, I've read stories. You know, unless you've been really, really badly abused, they just don't want to know. And so it's so important that we stand in solidarity as women, as men, alongside each other, supporting each other and breaking down capitalism so that we can be who we want to be and say what we want to say and feel confident and happy in who we are.
Brilliant. The woman with the striped shirt will be followed by the woman with the red shirt at the back. And if you can keep your contributions to less than 3 minutes, that way we get as many people in as possible.
My friend before, after the Women's Day, called me and told me that a boy was physically, sexually harassing her. I was very angry about this, and then she did tell the teacher on the same day, and it did happen in front of a teacher, and she told me that nothing happened. So the next day I went to school, and it happened again in the second period, and my friend hit him with a book, and then I came afterwards and hit him with the bag, and then I got in a lot of trouble for, assaulting people when he was sexually assaulting my friend, and as well as that, my teacher, the head of Year 8, if you're wearing trousers or a skirt, she puts a penny down your skirt or trousers to see if they're too tight. And my mom did call in, and they said that they would do a assembly about it, and they haven't done it to this day, and I felt quite sad for her. And he still does it, and he still brags about it today. So.
I'm a teacher, and it really saddens me that there have just been 2 students who've experienced that and also had to be there for their friends rather than their teachers. And what I would do is encourage you to keep talking. If you are brave enough to talk in front of this amount of people, keep talking to your teachers. There are resources out there to support teachers in talking about sexism and allowing students to actually have a voice, particularly young women who are saying that they go to school and that they are experiencing these things. And there are teachers in your school who will do something about it. We did a campaign at school recently called No to Sexism, and it was actually really difficult because not only were we talking to students and getting difficult conversations with boys where they were saying, no, there needs to be support for boys, it should be International Men's Day, and I understand that because actually there is a huge thing about masculinity which is oppressing young boys as well and meaning that they can't speak up for themselves too. But we also need to remember what is going on in terms of women's oppression and how that is affecting our young girls in school as well, to the point where you two have both spoken about really horrendous things that need to be addressed and need to be addressed now. So if you are a teacher here, I encourage you to look up the NEU No to Sexism campaign and get it into your schools so that you can begin these conversations with the students in your schools as well, and also with your colleagues too. Thank you.
Comrade here, followed by the comrade in the navy at the back.
Thank you, Amy. Absolutely brilliant sort of survey, really, of the way in which sexism is endemic in every part of our lives in terms of, almost anything you could do in any institution that you could go into, that there's an enormous amount of work to be done, and there is only a collective solution, and sexism is structural. But what I want to come back on a little bit is the private spaces in which sexism takes place, because Amy's absolutely right. 2 women are murdered a week in the UK through domestic abuse. But 1 in 4 women will experience domestic abuse in their lifetime. 1 in 4 women. That is a quarter of British women experiencing domestic abuse. It is endemic. And 1.2 million women a year are counted as having reported domestic abuse, but you only get counted up to 5 times. You may have experienced it 100 times and reported it 100 times, and it won't be counted. And also, there's plenty of people who don't report it for all the reasons that we might have experienced or be able to imagine. And I think I just want to say really that alienation extends into private space, and this is the kind that capitalism thrives on there being public, a big gap between the public and the private, and we're here recognising the difficulty of addressing sexism in a public sphere. How are we going to address it in the private sphere? And I do believe it is what we do in the public sphere that will have that effect. But I just want us to sort of focus on some myths, really. There's a kind of myth that strong women wouldn't put up with abuse. It's a complete myth. It can happen to anybody. It doesn't matter how confident you are politically or how successful you are in your career. You can experience domestic. Sorry, I keep saying it's domestic abuse that it's described as. That's the legal term. There's the idea that if you don't leave the relationship, that it's not that bad, and maybe you like it. No. For many, many reasons, people don't leave relationships because they want to be loved, because the abuser is manipulative and is mixing the abuse up with in a cycle of abuse, love, gifts and sorry and so on, and then the build-up of the abuse again. It happens in a cycle, and we need to recognise this, that women aren't liking it because they stay in a relationship, and they can actually get to the point where they're so exhausted they can't get out of that cycle. That's part of the way that the abuser works, is to undermine your confidence and reduce you physically so much that you can't. And I'll wind up. So I really want to also say that abusers don't. I hate this abuse, and I sort of hate my abusers, but they don't benefit from the abuse that they've carried out. It's part of alienation. So yes, and I agree. How wonderful the idea that we teach people not to abuse rather than just surviving abuse. But yeah, we need a revolutionary solution. It is endemic. It's much bigger than we imagine, and we have to fight it at every level.
Hello, Tim from Norwich. I wanted to talk about equal pay and also the courts, but I'll probably just focus on the equal pay. I work for Reassure, which is franchised out part of Aviva in a weird kind of neoliberalism. And I work for Reassure, which is part of Aviva. It's an insurance company. Aviva officially has a really nice policy on equality and everything, very corporate policy. Its policy officially is equal pay, so is Reassure. Aviva also came out recently and said that they were for maternity leave for men, and it sounds all great. But actually, inside Reassure, we got the figures. An email came round where men earn 26% more than women. The gap between women and men and the management was actually between male and female in terms of management was 40%. In the union I'm in, Unite, it's about 10 or 11%. I think equal pay it's not like it's 8% or something, which is not good. It's going backwards. Like 25% is ridiculous. And the idea about patriarchy, because I've got a few friends who are feminists, and they're always arguing with me that it's to do with patriarchy, and I always argue back it's to do with capitalism. But at work, most of the line managers are female. The manager above them is female. And it really kicked off in my workplace when this came out. There's 25%, and women were posting up, why are men earning more than 25%? How is that even possible? And the younger men, because I think the MeToo campaign has had an effect on younger men who looked at the world and thought, gee, like, how is it? Don't want to live in this world as much. I don't think all men, in terms of raunch culture, want to live in this world. Some of the younger men were saying, were piping up and saying, and it was the female managers who actually came in to enforce the discipline. But we don't have a union, and they actually shut down the argument to try and stop the disruption. People, particularly women, were saying, how is it possible that you can have like 25%? So to end with, we need a campaign within the unions about equal pay, because Unite, the full-time officials in Unite, men earn on average 10% more than women. How is that possible? How is Unite? I'm in Unite. How am I supposed to go into my workplace and say we're for equal pay? Oh, but my union doesn't even have equal pay. That we have to change. And lastly, it was just on the courts, on something I read in America that my friend's mum and sister read to us. A woman at a campus who lived near a campus. She was a local girl, worked in the local town. She took her sister to like a party, and at the party, someone they put a drug in her drink or whatever, and she was completely inebriated, and a man assaulted her, and it was blatant. And some some other men found this and stopped this guy assaulting her, dragged her off. So there's witnesses, loads of evidence. The local copper, local police officer, logged it all down, saying we're going to lock this guy up. It went to court. The guy was a swimmer for the national American swimming team. He came from a rich family. He got off, basically. So I think it goes all the way. We have to have a demand about the courts. The courts don't take this seriously. The courts don't send people down. I'll stop. Thank you.
Yeah, I think God, this microphone's not very good, is it? I think the MeToo hashtag, the MeToo movement, it really represented like this huge wave of anger that people feel, doesn't it? And it felt for a while like we were on the front foot, actually, and it doesn't always feel like that sometimes. And it really felt like things were kind of crystallising around this movement, this demand. And I actually think it does matter as well, not to put too much sort of emphasis on this, but I do think it matters that the hashtag is actually Me Too. Like, people are putting themselves at the centre of what's happening. They're owning it. They're not feeling all the shame, and the kind of disgrace that women are taught to feel like when people treat them. Sorry about that. It's, and I think that's actually a powerful thing, that it's not just recognising it, but it's putting people at the heart of it. It is totally right, that, decades on after this. It's quite distracting though. Usually I'm loud enough. Women are still fighting for basic things, aren't they? Like control over our bodies, control over our workplaces, and things like that. I do think Trump was a bit of a wake-up call for people, actually. I do think it's gone off again. It's definitely not me now. I'll just shout. Women have been at the forefront of fighting Trump, haven't it? The women's marches 18 months ago, they were one of the first kind of reactions to Trump. The absolute arch misogynist, not just someone who kind of mentions sexual abuse and harassment, but actually boasts about it. The fact that he was elected to one of the most powerful positions in the world, I do think it matters. I think women are coming up against the limitations they're offered under this system. I think more women go to university than ever before. Actually, more women do reach kind of management positions before, even the very limited stuff we've got, like the amount of women in the FTSE 100 and stuff like that. It is still more than it used to be. But what they're experiencing is not the kind of openly sexist culture of 20 or 30 years ago, where they're being necessarily told to make the tea or whatever, or take the notes or whatever, but they are still experiencing acute sexual harassment, often at work, often in the structures that Amy kind of talked about in academia, where it's quite, lots of temporary work, where you're forced to kind of do things alone, with a supervisor, and stuff like that. As well, around the Me Too stuff, there was a pushback, actually, from the bigots at the time, and I think it's hard to remember that, but there was all that stuff in the papers about printing pictures of the women who had said, pictures of them in their underwear and stuff like this, and kind of alluding to stuff that maybe they weren't confident enough about talking about. but people talked about victim blaming and stuff like that.
Sorry,
but I think, sure, okay. I think as socialists, it's always like, what do we do about it? I think, we have to make it a collective response. Like if you look at Kirklees bin workers, they're having a strike now because one of their managers is racist, and they say we're not taking it anymore, and they've walked out over it. I think we need that kind of action. We need to be out on the streets. We need to be fighting it in a collective way. It can't remain any longer at the level of description, although important that is people identifying with the fight, but actually fighting it together.
If you can keep it to 3 minutes, because I've been a bit lax, so we won't get everybody in. And the woman with the hat, where's she gone? There's a lady in the hat on the right hand side. You'll be next.
I try to use the microphone. Yes, what I think is important what Amy was saying was empowerment, and how can we get the empowerment, the collective empowerment against all these grievances. And I think in my lifetime it really changed, because in the last few years we had a demonstration on the 8th of March. We had not before. We had never had. This was absolutely amazing, because so many people, I think it's empty, turned up on the demonstration, and young people, older people, and men and women, and everyone. And this is a little bit a revival of the women's movement in Germany. We're having, at least. But also there were very good news last month from Latin America. In many Latin American countries, abortion is still very illegal, very illegal. And in Argentina was the case, and there was a huge movement for years, and it was intellectuals, writers, everyone. It was very broad, but it was mainly out of female school students and university students, and they had a 300,000 rally in Buenos Aires, and in a lot of province towns they had as well rallies, and they had 3 reivindications. First, sexual education in school, so to know what is happening with your body, free contraception to decide, and free abortion, not to die. And this is very important, because in estimates in Argentina there was 500,000 illegal abortions a year. And finally they really pressured the conservative neoliberal government and the majority they have, and the majority of deputies, to vote for the legalization of abortion, and it just after the Irish referendum. And I think it's a victory that we have really to emphasize. And the same month in Chile, which is also a neoliberal, very conservative, hierarchical society, university students have occupied a whole series of universities, and I think this is important, it's important for the young school students, against sexual harassment on university by professors or students, because they had such a, they were so outraged because one professor was not really punished, and so the whole of the universities in Chile are occupied against sexual harassment. And what the reivindication is for feminist education from the beginning to the end. And I mean, it's also a female and man movement, and it's also an anti-neoliberal movement. It comes from there. But it's very interesting for us, I think, to have those examples.
Is that working? Yeah, you say. Yeah, good. Just the MeToo as well campaign I will talk about. I think it hit every woman really at that moment. So it took me time to think if it's MeToo. And then when I realized, go through my life and see so many events that, yes, it is. And then, had that courage, had a length of time to think about it, length of time to decide, I'm going to write something on my Facebook and the hashtag that I've been experienced that. And then I see lots and lots of friends and family people, women, posting the same thing. So I thought it's incredible, I feel encouraged to speak out and actually name the thing. One of my educated, British-born girls, very educated, she listed this event happened to her on the airplane. And I said to her, this is called sexual harassment. You have to name it because, you can say, oh, a guy wasn't sitting next to me and make me uncomfortable, da-di-da, da-di-da, but you actually don't click it. And when I say to her, this is the name of it is sexual harassment, what happened to you. If you, shout it out on the airplane, say, stop harassing me, you sexually harassing me, then things will stop. So I think women start to think and put the name on the, uncomfortable feeling that you have because somebody done something to you. And I had this conversation as well with my mom, which is 70-year-old back in Yemen, which is, totally different society. And then me and her talked, and she was encouraged by the campaign itself. And she thought about her life and what she'd been through, and she was telling me stuff. And I was astonished, really, that even my mom was saying, oh, what happened in America? And she was relating to what's happened and the media and so on. And she reflected on her own life, and she addressed a lot of issue with me through her family and experience that she had through. And she named it as MeToo, my mom as well. And then my daughter turned up, she spoke earlier at 8 and said to me, Mom, that's what happened. And then when she took the event to the event have friend, she had 2 weeks detention or whatever it is. You have to do reports and go and sign up something as if like she'd done the wrong thing, and she just defended her friend. And I spoke to the teacher, which is a female. It was the day after the Women International Day, and it was all female teacher. And I said, shame on us, how we can put up with that again. And the girls coming to you, I send my daughter to school to be in a safe place. You're not creating the safe. So I tried to challenge her, and I said, the boy doesn't need, to be like not talked to. We need to put education that the boy understand, not punished. But the culture of understanding this is not appropriate, that's not acceptable. You will stop it happen in the workplace when these boys move to life and understand. Because punishing, they go and sign something or stay in detention. So they're not learning anything that they actually done wrong. And, but there is nothing in the school. And my daughter had to do and be threatened that she's not going to go to France or wherever she was going because what she done, defended her friends against sexual harassment. So what we coming after, I think one of the women was earlier mentioned. So I was just saying to my daughter, if that happened, I think all the girls need to walk out of the classroom. Yeah, no, it's just from that meeting she come up with that. So we walk out of the room and say, unless you make it safe, we're not going to come to study. Make it safe for us. So.
I'm not going to get everybody in, so if you can keep it disciplined, and then Sheila will be the last speaker.
All right. I don't know how close I need to put this. Is it close enough? All right, brilliant. I was 7 and in school uniform when 2 boys held me down and assaulted me. I was 7 and I was in school uniform. I was 11 when I was in school uniform again and a boy threatened to rape me. I was 12 and I was in a math class and a boy groped my best friend. It is not a dress thing. I am in a summer dress right now, and that does not mean I deserve sexual assault more than someone in a 4-piece suit. I deserve the same respect. I deserve the same rights as anyone else in this room. And we all need to band together, and we all need to make sure that everyone is heard. Because when my best friend, she told the teachers, oh, this happened, this is what happened to me, I need help because we've both got anxiety, and so going into that classroom triggered her so badly that she broke down. Now, every time she sees that boy and his friends, all that she gets is that she's a snitch. All that she gets is that she really liked it. And that needs to stop, because as soon as I retaliate, as soon as I say, actually, you're wrong and you are not being respectful, I am told to be quiet. I am told, no, it's done and dusted, he's been punished. He was given a day's isolation. He wasn't even suspended. Nothing happened, and he still goes around and does it. I know that he does. I've heard from other girls, and it needs to stop. Like, I'm just trying to make the point that it's not a clothes thing, because there's still a lot of stigma that, oh, I'm going to wear trousers and boots, and I'm going to wear a full jumper, so it won't happen to me. But if you're sitting there thinking, oh, I can prevent this to myself by making myself a certain way, you are saying, I'm going to make sure it's the other girl or the other boy or the other person. And that's it. I tried to keep it short.
I just want to start by saying, really, I take my hat off to the 3 young women who have actually spoken about their experiences in school, because the vulnerability of being as young as that and facing what you shouldn't have to be facing. But the second thing is facing the reality of the hierarchy in the school. And this is where I actually want to reinforce what the speaker before said when she talked about actually the young women walking out. Because having been a head of year myself and having been a teacher myself, I know actually we can't rely on the teachers and we can't rely on the heads of year. We actually have to start with how the most vulnerable, the most oppressed in the school actually organise as school students about it. Now, that is going to vary from case to case, but actually the key starting point has got to be the collectivisation of the issue and actually acting collectively. And whether that is you decide to start a petition inside the school over it and collect as many signatures as possible about saying there is sexual harassment, it has to stop, there has to be education about it, all the kinds of things that you talked about, whether it is in your particular tutor group, you can get your tutor to take it up, whether you can actually get people to agree to walk out if it actually happens again. That is something that each person is going to have to discuss, and hopefully there will be comrades here who will actually take part in that discussion and think it through. And the other thing about it is doing things which aren't necessarily immediately directly connected. That if you can get friends, a group of you, to go on, say, a local anti-racist demonstration, to go, if you're in London, to go on the anti-Trump demonstration, if you can actually get collective activity with your friends, including actually your male friends, you begin to create a strong collective who is assertive inside the school, who put your opinions, who actually argue, who will protect one another, and know that know that you're actually right, and begin to rock back against the backward ideas, because you are involved in a tussle of ideas as well as a tussle of behaviour. And I think that, thinking about it, we have to collectivise it, because when we actually collectively organise, we feel the strength of people round about us. You get the energy if you're on a demonstration from other people. You can feed that then back into keeping going and organising it yourself. And actually, school students have a brilliant tradition of struggle. If you think about I know this is a long time ago, but the Stop the War movement, the tradition in Tower Hamlets where I'm from, the school students who walked out of their schools, got over the school walls and marched into London, actually you are treading in, there is a very fine tradition to relate to, and I think that's really important to build on. And if you start doing that in your schools, it will then force the teachers to begin to address the questions as well. I wouldn't wait for the teachers. Actually, the school students have to take the lead themselves.
Well, yeah, I too would like to thank all the speakers, and particularly the young women who got up and shared their experiences. It's very important, actually, that people do feel able to share their experiences, and it's not this hidden thing. And that's part of what the MeToo movement has brought out. But, listening to it, my God, what an indictment of our society. that it is so sexualised at such a young age that people are experiencing this. And I think this has got worse in society. See, I don't think you can just attribute it to the individual bad behaviour. This behaviour is shaped by these young men, young boys and young women in this wider society, where everything when you grow up is so gendered, from the toys to how you're played with, to the clothes, to the sexualisation at a young age of young people. It is not a surprise that young people are very, and young men distorted by it. And I think it's right about the teacher as well. This is a problem for, that said, it's a problem for all people in growing up in this. And I think it's right. People have talked about a collective response. It made me remember actually my own school days, and it was a long time ago, and it was a lot more progressive actually. But our teacher called one of our friends Blondie, but we want our whole class to send him to Coventry, including the boys, and he had to apologise. And I would definitely say collective action is what's needed on whatever level. But I also want to put what's happening in schools in a bigger context as well, because I'm not surprised. It's a wider society problem, but look what's happened to schools and neoliberalism, the attacks on schools, the academisation, the attacks on trade union organisation, that actually children in schools and young people in schools are really seen as exam fodder, they're treated terribly in a hierarchical way, and actually teachers are and had attacks as well. You know, actually, when the teacher spoke about having the union having a policy, no to sexism, that would be something you want time to develop in schools. You want time in the curriculum to talk through sex education and relationships. Most of that has been scrapped in favour of it. So I think you have to see these problems as part of attacks, of wider attacks on our class, and a wider throwing back and repackaging, if you like, of ideas about women's bodies that are then being sold at ever younger ages to people that are then shaped by it. So this is a terrible big picture, but you've got to see it in that way to think, how do we come out of it? And I think it's right when people talk about the collective action in that way, because, you know, I think we have to take inspiration from things like the abortion rights campaign in Ireland. Don't forget, Ireland has had this massive influence of the Catholic Church, a really reactionary institution, and yet that campaign was won by the majority of people voting. And that means people went out and won, you know, women were at the forefront of it, winning all their male friends, their granddads, their fathers. You know, it won people to an argument as part of a collective campaign. That is very, very important. And by the way, when you think about it, in Ireland, not only now winning around abortion, but actually same-sex marriage, actually one of the first places to say trans people can self-identify, you know, more progressive things coming out of those bigger battles. And this is why I want to put these questions of collective action as well, and the fight for women's rights within those collective fights, because actually when you look at gains for women as a whole on every level, when have they gone furthest the most? When did we actually get legislation around equal pay or abortion rights? There were times of mass class struggle in the 60s and 70s that actually raised things for all workers, men and women. It was part of a bigger fight in society that put women's oppression and the fight against it on the agenda as well, where working class men and women fought side by side. And what we're trying to say is that men have an interest in fighting alongside and can be one to do that, and ideas can change, particularly change quickly in the course of struggle. And that's what we hope for, you know, the young women speaking today. We've been given some brilliant examples about what hopefully you can go back to your schools to go and do. But we have to think how we do this on every level, don't we, when we come out of here. And one of the things I do want to say is that anyone who can get on the Trump demonstration is going to feel a lot more confident if you go with your schoolmates, your workmates, anybody else, because he is part of trying to normalise this behaviour. You know, it doesn't just come from the bottom up and individual acts. It's been normalised by the President of the United States to say this is okay, and we're about saying it's not to be normalised. And actually Trump brings together many issues that people want to fight against. It unifies you, you know, who wants to support Trump, you know, whatever issue it is, you can fight against it. Let's bring it out there, but let's actually think about how we build movements that actually fight in the here and now, absolutely against every instance of the behaviour that we've heard today, collectively response in every workplace or university or school about what we do, But at the heart of that, we have to take on that whole system that is actually shaping and allowing these things to happen. And that's why we have to look at struggles that also challenge capitalism itself and actually wants to root out women's oppression totally. Because I don't think this is how we should have to live. We want to keep fighting these battles. We should be able to fight live in a completely different society where young people are not sexualised in that way, not treated in the way that we've been talked about, and actually grow up, like I said, to be able to really feel their potential. And that's for all of us, actually being able to control that society. That's a bigger fight, but it starts with all the little things we talked about today about how we collectivise in the here and now.